and thank you, panelists and everyone who's here in the audience, so to speak. So first of all, I'd like to just remind you what Emily said. Please actively use the chat function. As you're thinking of questions, feel free. As you have resources, feel free to put links, and we will keep track of all of that stuff, and I'm sure take advantage of them. And also just underscoring, give as much as you can to support Peace Development Fund, who's been around for 40 years. So as Emily said, no small feat. So let's get started without any further commentary from me. We have this illustrious group of speakers this afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And before I start with the official questions, I'd like all of us to really think about, when we imagine peace, what is that actually, and what does it look like to you from your respective vantage points, from your own history of activism, and so just really thinking about imagining what that actually would look like, especially in these times when things are looking very bleak all over the world. So starting with that question, I'm going to go in the reverse order of the names that are listed. Emily mentioned 40 years. I think WILP is the oldest organization on this list of organizations. So perhaps, Darian, you can share with us a few words about what the Women's Peace Initiative has meant to you and WILP and the work that you're doing. And as before you speak, please give us a brief bio of who you are.
Okay, very briefly, I'm a longtime activist in a wide range of political actions that include environmental activism, racial justice activism, and peace activism, to say nothing of feminist activism. I'm currently president of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the U.S. section, as we call ourselves. WILP is an international organization, and I'm with the U.S. part of that international organization. So for us, the Women's Peace Institute really helped to open up our imaginations, our sense of what was possible, because we did not have a strong sense of what other women's peace groups, how they were addressing international issues. Through the WPI, the Peace Institute, we had ideas and ways for interacting with these other women's peace groups suggested to us. So we were encouraged to reach out to do more collaborative interaction and undertake initiatives together. At the same time, we have only so much capacity, like many other groups these days. The volunteer base that we depend on so much is not so available. Even before the pandemic, people's lives have become more and more filled. So finding the capacity to reach out to other women's peace groups has been a challenge for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, let's turn it over to Gwyn Kirk.
Thank you, Margot, and thanks everybody. Thank you, PDF. Fiscal sponsorship and everything means a lot to us. The gathering we had at the Women's Building in San Francisco was really interesting and inspiring because we got to learn firsthand what some other women's peace groups are doing. I'm involved, also Margot and some others, in a small group, Women for Genuine Security, which is mainly based on the West Coast of the United States, continental United States. And we are in an small international network that mainly links women across Asia Pacific locations who are all dealing with US militarism and the impacts of US militarism on their own government policies and their own military policies. So we've been around for about 25 years, nowhere like the time frame of WILP, but also with some history and pedigree, and have built a lot of relationships in that time, across the groups and organizations that we're part of. I would say that we probably haven't built on the opportunity of the Women's Peacemakers Initiative as much as we might have done, which is partly a capacity question, or mainly a capacity question. We're small. And also COVID, I think, has upended kind of a lot of the ways we were working before and made it more challenging. I can talk a bit more later about what we've been doing. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Gwyn. Next, I would like to turn it over to I guess the tech people in this group, the tech experts. And please go ahead. Adele Vrana.
Hi, I was just checking. Is it me?
Yeah, it's you. You're the tech expert.
Yeah, so I am Adele Vrana. I'm Brazilian from origin, but have been in the United States for the last 11 years. I'm speaking to all of you from the Olon Lisjan territory in the East Bay of the Bay Area in the United States. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be with all of you, to re-encounter and be again with this fabulous women that were at the initiative in 2019. I am one of Whose Knowledge co-director, and Whose Knowledge is a global multilingual campaign to center the knowledges of marginalized communities online. We are the majority of the world, but our content and our voices and our rights, unfortunately, are seen as minorities. And we do that, we work in the intersection of technology, as Margot said, but also really epistemic and knowledge justice and feminism, right? So I am an activist, a feminist from the Global South that then work with communities around the world to center our knowledges online. And we are really grateful to PDF because we have been a fiscal sponsored organization from the beginning, from the origins of Whose Knowledge. We were introduced to PDF via Christine, and she recommended the fiscal sponsorship. And it was a way for us to really see that big dream come into reality, right? So we have a lot of great gratitude to the fiscal sponsorship program. And this is a really special week for us. We are celebrating Whose Knowledge's 5-year anniversary. And it's amazing to be here celebrating with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Adele. And Christine, you're next. Why was the initiative important to you?
Thank you, Margot. And so great to see all of you. Many of you who have been my teacher and inspired and part of Women Cross DMZ. For those of you who are new to Women Cross DMZ, we're a global movement of women mobilizing to end the Korean War, which is actually the oldest US military conflict, now lasting over 70 years. And we also have such deep gratitude to PDF. PDF quickly responded to our request to become part of the fiscal sponsorship. And without it, we would not have been able to raise the money to get us across the DMZ in 2015. So our deepest gratitude. And all the ways that PDF has supported us from, I still remember Kathy Sharkey teaching me about this pyramid fundraising strategy, and I still use it today, even as our organization is, almost $750,000 budget. And we're just so, it's incredible that we have now got our own 501c3, and we couldn't have done it without PDF. And Susan Yan, who was also introduced to us by PDF. Anyway, we can kiss your feet for all the work, but it was really inspiring to be with all these feminist leaders and visionaries to think through together the role, really. I mean, especially many of us are part of diasporas, but we are based here in the US, and we see the devastating consequences of US militarism and war. And now that we're at the 20-year anniversary of the war on terror, it was really an important opportunity to see and recognize and vision together what kind of US foreign policy could we see that isn't so militaristic, that isn't so violent, that isn't continuing to dominate the rest of the world. And I think it's always inspiring and energizing to be together. And so I think one concrete thing Women Cross DMZ left with was the importance of trying to build a more powerful grassroots feminist vision of a new US foreign policy that is more democratized, that is more feminist, principled centered. And so one thing that we did take away from there and began to build is the Feminist Peace Initiative, which we started with Grassroots Global Justice Alliance and Madre, two organizations that have a lot of experience working, especially in the Middle East and the Americas, and really trying to do away with the binary between domestic and foreign policy, because what the US does around the world doesn't just impact those people, but impacts us and our security here. So thank you for bringing this really important convening together and letting us imagine together a different, more feminist and peaceful world that we can build.
Well, thank you. Those comments are excellent ways for us to get started. I think, when we're in movements, one of the things that is really important for us to keep in mind is, what lessons have we learned? So we're at this really critical moment in history. And so, if you were to look back to the Peace Initiative and before, whenever you got started, and if you even think about your genealogy, each of you, can you just speak about one of the most important lessons you've learned during this period? And I know, I'm sure all of you have learned a lot, but I'm very mindful of the time. So if each of you could speak to that. And I don't want to just call on people. So if you just raise your hand, and whoever wishes to speak first, go ahead. So what's been your most important lesson?
I can go first, and sorry, Gwen, you go.
No, go ahead, Adele.
Okay,
please.
So I'm even pasting a link here in the chat as well with a website. And I really think the origins of that work, it's called Origins. And it was a work that one of our co-directors, Siko Balters, she left whose knowledge after the pandemic as a co-director, but co-founder should always be a co-founder. And she was at the meeting that we were all together, right, the Peacemaker Initiatives in 2019. And one of the things that really was a lesson that I took from that meeting, being with all of you, it was the inspiration, but it was the sense of feminist solidarity, and how when you come together, and you just mentioned the origins, you just mentioned our genealogy, right? And Siko and I, we sat together, me as a Black woman from Brazil, her as a white American, to come together and weave our stories. We talked about how looking at our origins, her past and her ancestors connected with my past and my ancestors, and we built this work. And it was during that meeting, spending that time together, that this idea and this connection, and how we as feminist women have to be really, right, like what we say and do within our organization have to be what is also transpiring outside, and that what becomes peace. When we can look at our ancestors have done, and we can come together and build different dreams and futures, we can then achieve peace. So I wanted to bring the link to all of you, and would like to invite you to read after this conversation. But it's a deep, really heartfelt feminist weaving stories that came from that event as well.
Wow, I can't wait. Okay, keep going. This is wonderful. Gwyn, I think you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, partly I was just being helpful to the moderator, but I can go. I think one of the most important things I've learned overall is the importance of building relationships, and that when we build relationships, we kind of enter into relationships of joy and solidarity, but also for those of us, especially who are located in the United States, tremendous responsibility for what our government and tax money and so on is doing in our name, ostensibly, in the places where these women are living. I want to just say a little bit about what I've learned about feminism. To me, feminism is not equal opportunities to be part of a rotten system. It's really a transformational feminism that repudiates patriarchy and racism and nationalism, and embraces, a vision. Adele said it nicely earlier, of genuine security and sustainability that's really based on justice, reciprocity, care, and love. And I see all those things really reflected in PDF's mission statement, which is one reason why, Women for Genuine Security, we were so glad that PDF, would be our fiscal sponsor, because we felt those values really aligned well.
Yeah, thank you. Next, let's keep moving.
I'll just speak up that one of the things that really impressed me about the WPI was the idea that there are these other wonderful women's peace groups out there with whom we can and must work collaboratively. Our work in the last few years has become more and more focused on doing collaborative work in order to really maximize what we can accomplish. And that does take a lot of attention and maintenance to build collaborations, to be able to stay in step with each other, or at least in tune with each other. And that isn't always easy. It also means that sometimes we have to directly address, well, where do we differ? Where do we have differing approaches? And what do we have in common that we can build on? So we're definitely working with more and more different kinds of organizations to get the work done that's so critical. Thanks.
And Christine.
Gosh, there's so many great things that were said that I want to just, gosh, I don't even know. Like, one thing that I would say is, I've learned so much. I mean, I think about like Margot and Gwyn, for example. They have taught me so much about militarism. I mean, probably I've become a diehard peace activist because of them and their work on really critiquing militarism and really like centering the voices of women and the people that are most impacted by US militarism. So I think like that is such an important takeaway, but I also feel like, how do we broaden this movement? How do we energize young people to see how all of our futures are connected together? How do we bring in new voices so that we can be powerful and actually be a formidable peace movement that could take on the Pentagon budget? And so that's for me, like, I feel like that's my mission. That's something I want to do for the next 20 years of my life as a peace activist. And, you know, like one thing that has like compelled me is like Women Cross DMZ started a feminist Korea Peace Fellowship, and we did advocacy training, communications and media training, and just like content on Korea, because North Korea is so vilified. We have such misinformation about the Korean War, which actually paved the way, I think, for the war on terror. And so that's just so important for me. And, you know, just like redefining who is a feminist? Is it just a woman in terms of like, you know, a woman identified, or how do we broaden? And so we did, of the 11 fellows that we selected, we picked, you know, a trans, a queer guy. So we really tried to expand the notion of who we view as feminists.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, as I'm listening to you, clearly all four of you are educators as well as being organizers and activists in, you know, so many ways. And I'm wondering, when you think about the lessons you've learned and when you look at your, you know, organization, your organizing, what are some of the biggest contradictions you face, you know, in doing the work you're doing? And how does that relate to the lessons? All of us.
Well, I can dive in.
Yeah, please.
There's like a whole list, but I
Just
feel
one.
like, okay, I know, but here's the thing is like, I think what we're trying to also do is like, as we try to disrupt the narrative about national security or what makes us secure, it's like we're dealing with a military industrial complex that continues to put on TV, CNN, and experts like on the whole withdrawal from Afghanistan, military generals, like people, defense contractors. It's like, and I feel like that's so challenging as a feminist peace activist. I mean, before I created Women Cross DMZ with a bunch of you, I started a think tank called the Korea Policy Institute. And I used to get contacted more to be on mainstream TV because I was with the Korea Policy Institute. And I feel like when we self-identify as feminist peace builders, we become ghettoized or we become marginalized in some ways. And it's this crazy contradiction. And I'm sure Adele has so much experience in terms of like, how do we define what is an expert? And I think that's a real challenge that we're trying to disrupt, that narrative of who is the expert. Is it the white guy sitting behind a computer studying North Korea satellite imagery? He is the expert, versus somebody like my colleague Hyun Lee, who has been around US military bases in South Korea. We've talked to political prisoners, defectors, divided family members, Korean Americans across multi-generations. Who is the expert? And I feel like that is a real challenge to us as women peace builders.
Thanks.
I'll jump in to say, here we are just one day away from International Peace Day tomorrow. But the idea of peace is hardly taken seriously. The peace movement should be considered credible, and peace work needs to have what might be called movement gravity. As it is, peacemaking struggles to go from being a feel-good kind of idea, and when we move to actually calling for cuts to US military spending, the opposition we get from the whole military industrial congressional complex becomes pretty much overwhelming. As Christine was just saying, we get no respect in the media. We are not worth talking to. Our ideas are not taken seriously. So the challenge is to identify what are some specific areas of peacemaking, some specific activities that could garner enough public attention and understanding and support to be able to stand up to that kind of organized opposition.
Mhm. You know, when I think about the word peace, you know, it just sounds so passive and so white. You know, I think about the old peaceniks, and this is a generational observation. So, you know, maybe Adele and Gwyn, can you talk a little bit about how to really kind of jazz up this concept so that, you know, how do we think about race? How do we think about class, and all those nation, which is one category that often gets left out, so that peace work isn't just, as Darian said, some feel-good concept. Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm kind of going off script here because the conversation is really exciting, and I want to, yeah.
Yes, I can go. I think that what I'm thinking here is really working, right, like in the intersections, right? And then instead of like the thinking about peace as a monolith and something that encompasses it all, thinking about those intersections that then bring those other elements, right? Because we are all multifaceted and multi identities, and they all have to come together. But I also had this association, and this was something that when we had that meeting, I was able to see all the multi facets that we all have and see them working in intersection. And I think that is how we bring, right, like those other elements of race, class, nation, all of those that you were identifying, Margot. And I think I wanted to speak to what Christine was saying, because I see whose knowledge, right, like we are working in those intersections of knowledge, justice, social justice, feminism, technology. And I think because of that, right, like we have survived this 5 years, right? And also, that is our contribution to the peace making movement, in terms of really questioning who are the experts, who are we, right, like listening to. So when we're talking about knowledge justice, is that right, like what are the epistemics lens and frames? Are we listening to the global north of the world, the white guy in the US and Europe, right? And we do a lot of work questioning that and showing that actually they're not the experts or shouldn't be, right? So I can see us jazzing up also the movement of peacemaking when we do that, when we question, right, like the expertise of those in the room, and then create materials and resources. And we do that all the time. We work with indigenous communities, women from the global South, Black and brown folks, to create their own resources. So we can say, here, see, we created that. This is published work, right? Like we have as much, if not more, legitimacy and expertise and knowledge to be saying those things that we are saying. So it is a little bit, right, like going and gaming the system, creating the sources ourselves, to be able to do that, right? To question the notion of expertise.
You know, Gwyn, I'm going to call on you next. And when I hear the number 40, I know that you were involved in the Greenham Women's Peace Encampment, and this is the 40-year anniversary of that. Although it's not continuing, it's made quite a mark in the feminist peace movement. Can you talk about, you know, the ways in which that was radical, and what would constitute a similarly radical peace movement now?
I'm laughing because Paul has put in the chat, Margot, you're the boss. So following that, I will do my best with that huge question you just threw at me. Yeah, I did not live at the peace camp. I was a supporter of the Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Common in Britain. I was living in London and doing various things. And, you know, like many people, I wanted the peace camp to succeed. It was a women's movement. That was one thing that I think made it successful. It was also a campaign of direct action. So it was visible, and that brought together all kinds of, you know, challenges and difficulties. You mentioned that many of us are teachers. I had a sort of teaching hat even back then. So one of the things I was doing was interviewing people, making a film, making a book, trying to amplify women's voices so that more people would want to get involved. Cruise missiles were kicked out of Greenham Common ultimately, but of course they're in use in many other wars, not the ground-based ones that were at Greenham, but air-launched and sea-launched missiles. So it's one of those, you win some and you lose some. And part of the thing about being 40 is, what is good about that movement that can be passed on that younger people might be interested in. And so one of the things that people my generation are doing is emptying our, drawers and cupboards from our precious Greenham materials, all of this pre-internet, pre-email, and putting them in archives, in libraries. It was a very dispersed movement. And so there's no definitive Greenham materials collection. They're going to all kinds of different places. I put mine in a place called Mayday Rooms, which is a progressive, independent, nonprofit archive in London. And it's been thrilling to hear from them, that younger activists are coming and going through those boxes of stuff that I, lovingly collected because that movement meant so much to me. But I want to pick up also on something that Adele said about expertise. And Brennan invited us to send him links. And so I have a link I'd like to share because it links to what Christine and others are saying about, the concept of peace. Our international network calls ourselves Women Against Militarism. Two negative words, against and militarism, right? Our local group in the US calls ourselves Women for Genuine Security. But notice that none of us are using the word peace because it seemed to have been co-opted partly by, official dialogues, peacekeeping forces, and that kind of a thing. And because people didn't feel it was strong enough. But we have put out and do from time to time, a whole statement as an educational and organizing tool around what we think genuine security really is in all its dimensions. And one of the things I like about Peace Development Fund is also the very broad way that you all think about peace, whether it's environmental justice and racial and economic justice, LGBTQ rights and all the rest of it, and seeing peace very broadly like that. I think that that's where, a more integrated, quote, peace movement, whatever we would call it, needs to go. Look at the energy of Black Lives Matter, which is about peace and non-violence and stopping violence in community. Look at the energy of the folks who are stopping these pipelines and thinking about, the earth as our mother and all the rest of it. We've got to sort of, I think, make more integration between different issues so that, yes, it's about foreign policy, but it's much more than foreign policy. It's about imagining, as several people have already said, a whole way we want to coexist on this planet.
Yeah, thanks. And, that the whole idea of peace, coexistence, radical vision, feminist vision are all very important. And I was thinking also that, being connected to the US state, that's a whole nother topic that I'm gonna have you all talk about a little bit. But before I do that, Gwyn, you talked about you've been saving, this amazing things, and all of us are hoping to pass on whatever we've learned to the next generations or next generations to come. What's one thing you don't want to pass on? What's one, and this goes to the lessons, what's something that you hope folks won't have to do again or will not do because it didn't really serve the movements?
I don't want to pass on despair or organizing based on fear. I think organizing has to be based on hope and radical intention for change. But I actually don't think fear mobilizes people beyond a certain point.
Okay, the rest of you, what do you all want to let go of and not pass on?
Well, I'm still working on it, but I feel like the huge lesson that I've learned in the past decade or so of doing this work is letting go of the kind of heroine model, or the like, I can do it myself thing. And I think that is hugely damaging to leaders. It's hugely damaging to building organizations and movements. And it's a terribly unsustainable model. And so how do we think about doing it in a truly feminist way that is about circles, about broader concentric circles of support, of solidarity, and doing it in a totally different way that doesn't replicate patriarchy, hierarchy, and some of the broken systems that we're trying to change.
Anything else you all want to let go?
You go, Darian. Yes, you can go.
Well, you'll see why I especially wanted you to go first, Adele. One of the things that we're confronting these days in, I think, a lot of sort of traditional progressive political circles is the whole issue of white supremacy and the kinds of built-in structural elements that have kept a wider range of people out of this kind of activism, out of our particular peace movements, which tend to be dominated by white liberals or progressives or whatever we call ourselves. But it is a predominantly white movement, I think in part because the emphasis on peace has not focused on the enormous costs to people all over the world, particularly people of color in other countries, of US wars. And I'm talking about the US as a major source of militarism in the world today, and the enormous cost here in this country of, I believe the latest figure for the last 20 years of the war on terror is over $8 trillion. $8 trillion that we could have been spending on so many critically needed human needs in this country. But that doesn't get as discussed as it should be, and it doesn't get as much attention as it should get as a highly white supremacist system.
Yeah, we are saying the same thing, Darian, with different perspectives and words. But yeah, that is my experience, right? As a Black woman from the global South, is that I would not like to experience the social movements that I have been experiencing in my life and the others that came before me in the same way. We all know that even within the feminist movement, right? Black and brown LGBTQI feminists have had to, right, like fight their own way to have an agenda that includes us, that, right, like really centers us as well within feminism. And the same thing with all the other social issues that we are seeing here. So I would like, right, like for the women that are coming, the Adeles of the new generations, Margot's and Darian's, Gwyn's and Christine, to be in a place where that would not be their same experience. And one thing else that I wanted to say is that one of the things that the work that I brought the link made me see is that for us, right, like the majority marginalized, we have a lot of generational trauma. And in doing our work in the social movement, that, right? Like we can't really do the work and be the feminist activists that we need to be for ourselves and each other and the younger generations if we don't heal those traumas, and if we don't allow ourselves to speak up, to be in the room, to be present, despite the systemic issues that we are fighting for, because otherwise we're not going to dismantle them, right? We're not going to dismantle those systems if we cannot be ourselves in our fullness. So just this awareness of there are the generational traumas that many, many times keep us behind. And it is part of the healing, right? And the liberation to take care of those, to address those, and to be fully in the rooms we are in.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to just interject a comment here. And that is that, I'd like all of us to remember that women of color in the US and definitely women of the global South, have had vibrant women's movements, and so I don't want us to forget that and center that, it's the white women and we had to carve our way, right? Yeah, some of that happened, but really, you think about the history of women's movements globally, Black, brown, yellow, red, whatever, women of color have been doing the work for a long, long time. And so I want us to just honor that legacy, Adele and others, so that we're not kind of erasing their work, by saying women's movement is white movement.
Oh, yes.
So that's just the moderator's privilege here.
Yeah.
So what you all just talked about leads us to, the next question, which is, what do you think are some of the most important or key issues facing feminist peacemakers right now? And think about peacemakers in whatever ways you all want to do that. Key issues, challenges.
I can kick it off. Funding, number one. I feel like there's just inadequate funding for peace building overall, but definitely for a transformational feminist approach, it is woefully lacking. But also, I'm just going to speak personally, but it's Women Cross DMZ is now in its 6th year, and even I'm starting to think about, who should take the helm of Women Cross DMZ to bring new energy and vigor and vision and new ideas to the organization. And I think that's a real challenge. I think not just for the feminist peace movement, but for the peace movement overall. I think it's really time that we think about passing the baton to younger generations that can really inspire and mobilize new generations of people so that we can build a more powerful, formidable anti-war movement.
Passing the baton, that seems like a pretty common metaphor. And this is just a rhetorical question while you all are thinking of what you want to say next. Can we think about another metaphor for that kind of movement, So just, okay, that's just a moderator privilege again. So challenges, key challenges, Darian.
I touched on this before. I think that it's just very difficult to get people to take peace seriously. It's considered impossible. And there is virtually no discussion of alternatives to arms and military interventions. It just, the media and the realm of ideas, of course, there are people writing about that, but in terms of what is available to people popularly, it's just ignored. So that if people want peace, they're going to have to, we are going to have to encourage, research, raise, insist on, and otherwise really support discussion of peace as an actual and current possibility. The UN global ceasefire got no media coverage and was just cast aside as ridiculous idea. So we just don't get much credibility. And then the whole question of how to inspire a new generation of activists with a belief that peace is possible and how that can be approached would be much more doable if there were any general acceptance of the idea that peace is what we should be looking for, not security through more arms.
Gwyn, Adele?
When should I go?
Yes, please.
Um, yes, I will address your question, Margot, but I just want to say that I didn't mean to diminish us in the role of Black, brown women and Indigenous women across the globe. Yes, my Lord, audio Lord would, right? My ancestor would not be happy with me. No, it was just a way to say that, yeah, it has not been always easy to be seen as experts, to have people listening to us, even if our own communities were listening to us. So that's what I meant. But I think one of the biggest challenges that we have been seeing it's really, right, thinking about technology, and you called me out, right, like the technology aspects of it, is really seeing that if we are looking at the industry and militarization, right, we also have to call out capitalism as, right, like as being at the center of it. And when you look at the intersection right now of how social media and the internet, right, like in the all the ideal that we would be using internet for social good is going down, right? Like it's just being dismissed because it has been co-opted by the capitalist system. So we are today using, right, like social media channels. We are the products, right? Like, and the younger generations are really being co-opted and sucked into that. So you have this new culture of, right, like the influencers and the consumerism, right? Like the emptiness of it all, that there's really, right, like in the fact that we are not calling that out, right? Like capitalism is at the center of so many of our, right, like if not all of this systemic issues that we're trying to address, and at the same time is really, in my opinion, capturing, right, like the younger generation's energies and what people are doing, how they are spending their times. And we see that, right, like look at all the researchers to how the younger generations are now on their phones, what they're doing. So that is, I think, one of, right, like the challenges that if we are looking at who are coming next, right, like we're going to call it ancestors and then take this mission on. This is one of the intersections, again, one of the worries that I have.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, the irony of what you just said is that it's precisely the military that developed the whole internet thing, you know, that we're so tied to right now. Gwyn, any thoughts? And then we'll move to our last question. And after the last question, folks will have a chance to answer or ask questions yourself and, you know, offer your opinions as well.
Well, in addition to everything everyone said, I guess I'd like to add, building on Adele's comment about capitalism, you know, there's government intransigence around the world, and there's also all the profits that corporations are making out of war. And so that seems to me to be a key nub of what we're up against. You know, when we were here at the Women's Building in 2019, our group had with us Ayano Ginoza from Okinawa, And Okinawan people have been campaigning against a new US base construction in northern Okinawa at a place called Henoko. They've been campaigning against it for 25 years. They've done every single thing people can do. They've elected sympathetic politicians. They've signed petitions. They've sat out in the open. They've been in canoes trying to interrupt the ships that are trying to lay the foundation for this base extension, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we heard the other day that, on top of all that, now Okinawa has just discovered that its drinking water supply is being polluted by military bases, and the chemicals being leaking, and not only leaking, but being dumped into local rivers. And some of the soil and landfill that's being used for the construction of the Henoko base actually contains human bones and human remains left over from shallow burials following the bitter Battle of Okinawa at the end of World War II. Japan is about to go, Japan, which is kind of the overlord of Okinawa and is in cahoots with US military about this, paying for this new base construction, is about to, go into an election cycle for, new prime ministers. The four candidates standing, not one of them gives a toss about the base at Henoko. And, so they were desperate and sounding very desperate about the situation. It's a small island. It seems like it's a long way away. Many people don't know anything about it. But of course, it's part of this whole, military basing complex that the US has developed around the world. And I can't help but think about how, when we were together in the Women's Building, Ayano talked about Okinawa then, and want to give that update, really, because it's an example, one small example of this intransigence that, that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. And for us in the US, a lot of the things happening are so far away that we don't actually have to look at it, right? And that's what it means to be in the dominant position. Yeah. So we have about 3 minutes left. I'd like each of you just to give us maybe a word or two, very concisely. What do you all need right now to do your work? I mean, besides dismantling capitalism and all that, right? But something specific that donors, funders can support you all.
Well, I can go first. Tomorrow we're having an event on International Peace Day with Madre and GGJ called Beyond the War on Terror, A Way Forward with Grassroots Feminists. And I'll be speaking about Korea, and we'll have Hoda, who is Iranian, this woman Spojmi, who's from Afghanistan, and Yanar Mohammed, many of you know, from Iraq. And so it's, I think it would be great if many of you could join in that event or help amplify it. And this is the Feminist Peace Initiative. And then I'll drop the link. I just think it's really important as feminist peace builders to disrupt the narrative that US empire is going to save women. Never has.
Great. So yes, Adele.
I also have an invitation because, as I mentioned in the beginning, Whose Knowledge is celebrating 5 years this week. We are going to have, speaking of irony, a Twitter party, and I'm bringing a link here. But there are other ways. We just launched our newsletter, and we're going to release a blog post as well, highlighting the work of our communities in these 5 years, right? Because as we know, right, like it's not the work of us, the team, 6 people, 6 women that are doing this work, is the work of our communities. So I just want to invite all of you, and I think some of the things that I spoke about here, right, like in some of the frames, they really, right, like relate to this intersections and to the Women's Peacemakers Initiative. in a way that if we're questioning the expertise, if we are like looking at the marginalized as who we should be looking at and listening to, we then can like have I think other dreams and perspectives around our understanding of peace and beyond. So just wanted to leave this invitation for all to join us in the celebration, because feminism and this movement is also should be about joy as well. So that's the invitation.
Thank you, Adele. All right, quick comments from you two, Darian and Gwyn.
Gwen was first.
Okay.
Except maybe not. I'll just quickly say, in this age of increasing climate catastrophe awareness, we are way overdue to begin paying attention to the military carbon and toxic footprint.
Yeah.
That is so ignored and so much a part of the problem.
Okay.
Thank
I'm
you.
taking this
Gwyn?
question to be what we need,
Yeah.
right? To do, okay, we need money, social media, web designers, translators, people to help us keep our books, and all that kind of basic stuff. We're small groups. Women Cross DMZ maybe is excluded from this, but basically we are small groups and we want to do the work. We do not want to do all this tiresome stuff that goes around doing the work. So we need a lot of help with that.
So lots of practical support. Okay, so there you have it from our speakers. So thank you, the 5 of you or 4 of you, and let's hear from you all who have been patiently waiting and chomping at the bit to say something. Please unmute yourself. Well, raise your hand and unmute yourself. And what are you thinking? What are you feeling? What's going on? Nothing?
Just as a reminder for folks who are struggling to raise their hand, it is in the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. You can also type questions into the chat.
Yes, and just unmute yourself and go ahead. Okay, Paul says there's a good question in the chat. There are many questions, but what is the impact of MacArthur on longer funding these subjects? What's MacArthur doing to fund the subjects? And I think you're talking about the peace and security track they have or had. Yeah.
To be honest with you, I have no idea because I imagine none of us got any funding from MacArthur. But I know that like a group like Plowshares probably got funding from MacArthur, and there was a small women's initiative at Plowshares that has given some money to Women Cross DMZ. So, yeah.
Well, okay, so since nobody's asking questions, let me ask you all another question. Everybody in this conversation is, you know, Gil Scott Heron, the revolution will not be televised, and then Insight Women of Color Against Violence said the revolution will not be funded. So how are you all thinking about, you know, carrying on the work, putting in really the radical edge? Gwyn, you talked about direct action. There hasn't been a lot of that lately. You know, so how are we thinking about the thrival of the work? You all were lamenting peace as, you know, such a kind of seems to be such a bland concept, even though it's life or death for most people on the planet.
Well, you asked a question earlier about contradictions. And I think this money thing is a real contradiction. Yes, we need money, but there are certain ways in which money contaminates the work because it divides people who are paid from people who are not paid, and it makes paid workers seem like they're doing the work. It means that everybody else is called a volunteer. and yet they could be donating tons of time to something that, you know, they're not getting paid for. So, but I see that in this, the way the society is going, you know, Greenham Common, you asked about, Margot. Many people at Greenham Common were able to sign on as unemployed and get unemployment benefit, because at that point time, the unemployment regulations were looser than they are now. So much is tightening up that makes it very difficult to do things without money. And also money also structures, or lack of money structures, who can be involved, who can do this work. How are you going to pay for childcare or pay for basics, you know, if you don't have money? So I think this money question is really complicated, and it's important to be very direct and honest about money and its impacts.
Great.
The long term, you know, the longevity, I don't necessarily think that organizations have to last for over 100 years. I think sometimes organizations come into being to do a useful thing. They catalyze things. They're of their time. They generate a lot of interest and excitement, and they're a container for activism for a time. Now, they may not necessarily last. What we hope will come then is the new thing, which will relate to the new reality and the new analysis and so on.
Excellent point. Yes, how to end gracefully, I guess, is another way to say it when the time comes.
I mostly agree with Gwyn, and having been somebody who volunteered for about a decade before starting Women Cross DMZ and becoming a full-time peace activist, paid peace activist, I can see what having an organization with full-time staff devoted to communications, devoted to like congressional advocacy, devoted to organizing could really do to anchor a broader grassroots movement and try to change the narrative. Women Cross DMZ may be like, have greater capacity than a lot of other organizations, because I'm shameless about, we need the money, we're gonna go for it, and we're gonna build an organization that's gonna kick some ass. And as my great friend, Lisa Natividad from Guam, Guahan says, we're in it to win it. And so I do believe, like as Gwyn has taught me, we have to stop thinking like housewives and like, you know, start thinking like the generals and the CEOs. And so there's a part of me that's really torn. Yes, I know how money can corrupt, but we also can see what investments in powerful organizations can do.
And before I call on Jessen, I just want to pick up on a question that Eva Kaufman has put in the chat, and which is to generalize it. You know, what should be the relationships with these big suprastructural institutions like the UN and the development goals, you know, and all those things. So, you know, there's, Christine, you talked earlier about connecting domestic and foreign policy. Then how do you connect local, international, and global through an institution like the UN, if that's even, you know, worth the effort? It's kind of up for question from many of the grassroots groups that I'm familiar with. Jessen, I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
There is some confusion. My name is not Jessen Farrell. I'm Elaine Noneman, but I've popped into the space for the view space for Jessen Farrell. Not sure why that happened, but my question is really related to the progress of war over, you know, through centuries, and along within the active peace movement that goes back, you know, as far as Wolf does, and to, you know, from my generation, which is like 60s, 70s, you know, it's grown into something much more deadly. and has not been affected by the peace movement. What I'm concerned with now is, the fact that we're shifting now to drone war. So the military-industrial complex, as we know it, or as has been the, central target, is probably not that anymore. But also surveillance warfare, like the NSO and Pegasus software, and how it undermines all kinds of human rights organizing, and how probably each one of you is a target of that, if you haven't already been. So I'm, is there discussion about that?
Well, we only have about 5 more minutes, so I would like that to answer that question would take a long time. So I would like each of you to really, think about what are you trying to create? What would a truly just world, and this was kind of going back to the original question, because things are already kind of doom and gloom, right? And so, what's the world you're imagining when our side wins? Do it till as Lisa would say, yeah, do it till we win, right? What would winning look like for us? And you have about 4 minutes, so each of you maybe take a minute, please.
So I'll jump in because WILF just had its virtual Congress for 2 weeks in August, and one of the many presentations there specifically discussed the importance of feminist foreign policy. And feminist foreign policy, for me, really describes the kind of world we are seeking to create: international understanding of values and policies based on equality of all women and all people, but we're focusing on women, and an end to violence against women. Also supporting and continuing to advance international peace organizations and organizing working with women, so that we are looking for various kinds of rights, political and economic access and equality, education, all these kinds of things that I think are already well known. And of course, in a sustainable world that has a wonderfully diverse ecosystem.
Great. Christine.
Gosh, I mean, I think we're just trying to build a world that is more just and equal and compassionate. And I think that, Women Cross DMZ's contribution is trying to bring in closure to the oldest war that inaugurated the military-industrial complex, that set forth the US to be the world's police, that quadrupled defense spending in those 3 years. That was the first war, that was the coalition of the willing, that provided for the US to go to war without congressional authorization, to go to the UN to get support. So I think that it's a big task for us, but if we could do that, I think it would be a big contribution. And what we're trying to do with these other initiatives, like the Feminist Peace Initiative or the Create Peace Now campaign, is to really center the experiences of women, center feminist principles, and to show that there is another way that we could do this, by especially democratizing the process by which US foreign policy is made as the policy tool or arm of US foreign militarism. So it's a big task, but we're up for it. We're up for the challenge. And we know that we have amazing partners, like all the women that are on today's panel, and all of you that are, joining today, that provide the essential support to fund and build our movements. Thank you.
Thank you. Gwyn, Adele?
Okay, we can come up with all these lists of everything we want. I guess what I would say is we want to be living in a world where we really, really feel a connection to other people, that we are, I am because you are, that kind of reciprocity, and to the planet that sustains us. Everything else would flow from that. I'm skeptical about feminist foreign policy. I'll be frank about that. I think it can probably come in different packages. I was skeptical, I'm afraid, when we talked about it at the Women's Building, and still today. I see there are some comments in the chat, that probably sort of reinforce my point of view on feminist foreign policy. Also, I think we need many more conversations like this, involve all kinds of people from all over the place, this country and so on, so that, that there's many more spaces to talk about these issues. As you said, Margot, critical issues, life and death for many people right now.
Adele, a final word for you.
Wow, and such responsibility after Gwyn talk about these connections, and believe that as well. I think, wow, for me, it is those connections, and it's also like us knowing each other. We talk about that a lot of the reasons why, like the reasons for conflict is the crisis of the unknowing, and it's not always that we can have those conversations, that we can be the fullness of ourselves. So I also am hoping in a world that we can have those conversations with the pains and the joys of it, but we can have that. That's the only way out is true. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful way to end it from all these four wonderful presenters and thinkers and doers. Thank you all very much. And now I'm turning it back over to Emily to take us to the end.
Thank you, Margot. Great questions, as always.
Yes, thank you so much to all of you. And thank you to everyone who came this evening. This has been an incredible way to kick off our 40th anniversary celebrations. Congratulations to Whose Knowledge on your anniversary. Congratulations to Women Cross DMZ for your upcoming events, and our event tomorrow, excuse me, and just thank you all to the rest of you all for being on this panel as well. So just as a reminder that we will be emailing you links to register for upcoming events, and I think that Brennan is also going to be putting that link in the chat. And in case you missed it the first time, we'll also put in the fundraising link that goes to our fundraising page for our 40th anniversary campaign, and hope you'll consider supporting PDF as we continue to celebrate during the 2021-2022 season. So thank you so much.
Song.
Yay, you're gonna play a song to go us out. Thank you so much, Margot.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Cuando pierda todas las partidas, cuando duerma con la soledad,
Little dance hour.
cuando se me cierren las
Bye everyone.
heridas
Thank you.
y la noche no me deje en paz. Cuando sienta el miedo del silencio, cuando cueste mantenerme en pie, cuando se revelen los recuerdos y me pongan contra la pared, resistiré, erguido frente a todo,
everybody. Thank
Margot,
you.
there's been a request to know what song that is.
Oh, okay. It's called. Yeah, oops. And if anybody wants me to DJ your party, just come.
Moderator by day, DJ by night.
Yay.
Thank you.
Let's hear it.
Thanks again.
Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye,
See
everybody.
you all.
Take care.
Bye. Bye.